Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. The 2nd Avenue Subway, East Side Access, the number 7 extension, congestion pricing, higher tolls, subway flooding, and fare hikes. Yikes. To talk about New York City's and the region's lifeblood, the mass transit system, is Elliot Lee Sander. Before becoming executive director and CEO of the MTA, Lee was a corporate senior vice president of a leading transportation engineering firm and also served as the director of the Rudin Center at NYU. He served as transportation commissioner under Mayor Giuliani, and his appointment as executive director in January 2007 was met with widespread approval and hope. Welcome, Lee.
Great, thank you, Doug.
This is, happy birthday. This is the MTA's 40th birthday. It was born in crisis, survived system-wide deterioration and renaissance. Let's take a brief look at how the MTA sees its history and future.
Ah, yes. Who can forget the 70s? The music, the fashion, the fads. The city in fiscal meltdown. It was a time when our hopes, our dreams, our city almost came to a grinding halt. Almost. After all, New York is a region where 14 million people always need to get somewhere. So the MTA got the funding to launch the largest rebuilding effort in U.S. public transportation history. Through successive 5-year capital plans and investment of more than $70 billion, the MTA has overseen a top-to-bottom overhaul of equipment, facilities, and infrastructure. What does it all mean for New Yorkers? It means nearly 4,000 new high-tech subway cars, the largest equipment purchase in mass transit history. It means new technologies to help customers get where they want to go. It means the nation's largest fleet of clean fuel buses. It means railroads with award-winning on-time performance. It means hundreds of miles of renewed track and over 200 renovated stations, including Grand Central Terminal, the crown jewel of New York. Comfortable? You bet. Safe? Absolutely. Graffiti? Gone forever. This is a new day, and we're turning the page to the next chapter in New York's transportation history, with subway service for the east side of Manhattan. Direct service from Long Island into Grand Central Terminal. Extension of the 7 line to the west side of Manhattan. Faster, easier connection of 9 lines in the lower Manhattan Financial District. And ultimately, a world-class, seamless regional transportation network. We're the MTA, and we're going your way. New York City Transit, Long Island Railroad, Long Island Bus, Metro-North Railroad, Bridges and Tunnels, Capitol Construction, and MTA Bus.
That was a really nice promo, great production values, and having lived through the gory days, I'm really looking forward to the glory days. Now, on March 3rd, as part of this almost 40th anniversary, you delivered the first State of the MTA address, and that promo was projected at that time. Talk about what's coming up, what us New Yorkers and those of us who come into the city every day can look forward to.
Well, first, what's most important in terms of looking forward is just maintaining the recovery from the 70s and 80s, fixing those stations, the track, the rolling stock. We almost, we literally went off the rails. We had derailments, 18 a year, just massive dislocation. So it's
breakdowns all the time, the graffiti as we saw in the piece.
As I mentioned in the speech, I ran I was the first general manager for Manhattan Bus Division in the 80s, and in my 4th month, the 2nd floor of the 100th Street Bus Depot, one of my bus depots, just collapsed. Luckily, there wasn't a bus on it, but for 4 or 5 months, we had to operate service on the M86 and the M101 off of a pier in the dead of night, overnight, on the Harlem River. So what's most important for the future is that the MTA continue its normal placement state of good repair to keep our system in decent shape.
So are we there? Do we have the appropriate rolling stock, signals, tracks? Is that in good repair? And we'll talk about the capital plan, this is the first priority.
Well, it wasn't an F, I would give it a B. In terms of New York City Transit, which was behind the curve because of its age, we still are a little bit behind in terms of stations. We would rather, we'd like to have all of our stations done within 35, 40 years. The schedule for stations is further out than we would like. We have an old signal system. We want to replace that. But for the most part, it wasn't an F, I would give it a B. Because the numbers are so big, getting to that A is hard. But I think New Yorkers can be very proud of the investment that previous governors, the legislature have made. We spent $76 billion to bring it back from the precipice to where we are now. And so we are, knock wood, in good shape compared to Chicago, compared to London. We're not in bad shape. What we can't do is take our eye off the ball and go backwards. So that's the first thing that I keep my eye on, which is maintaining, the system in decent shape. And the performances there are on-time performance is extremely good. Our mechanical breakdowns, as people know, they're not breaking down as they used to. So the system is performing at a highly reliable level. Overcrowded because ridership has grown by 40% since 1996. But in terms of the basic dependability of the system, in large part, we're pretty healthy.
Are you getting that from the public in terms of the various report cards that you've been serving people with?
Absolutely. In terms of approval ratings, in terms of our own metrics, in terms of on-time performance, in terms of the anecdotal feedback. And I take the system every day. I take it either every day from home or when I do
And home is where?
In Douglas and Queens.
Ah, the near suburbs.
So I'm on the system every day, and I use it to commute. When I do field visits, I generally take the system in from the field locations in. So I see the system myself. So I don't think I've not heard any New Yorkers quibble. What they will complain about is the overcrowding, and that is.
Also, they'll complain about other things. I mean, if you want a list of complaints,
fares and tolls and what have you.
And flooding, and et cetera.
We can talk about flooding too. Happy to talk about flooding as well.
Okay. So what needs improvement? Go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of what's ahead, the first thing is to keep our eye on the ball in terms of what we call normal replacement, stay good repair. Then, because of the increase in ridership since 1996. We also, looking forward, as I said, 40% since 96. Then looking forward over the next 25 years, we expect the population of New York City to increase by 1 million, the region by 3.5 million, and we need to expand and modernize the system so we can handle the additional ridership. We have 8.5 million, we're moving 8.5 million people on the system today. And
every day.
Every day.
So we're talking about 2.5 billion riders a year.
Right. So we need to be positioned as we get more population in New York and in New York City and in the region to accommodate more people. And so for the future, that's where we also have our eye on. We have to expand and modernize the system so we can accommodate this population growth. There was a time when it was only Lexington Avenue subway that was overcrowded. Now you look at many of our lines,
Sure.
not all of them, but many of them.
A lot of
they
your
are
into
overcrowded.
Queens and out of Queens into Manhattan lines are really packed.
Yes, the Queens Boulevard corridor, the EF,
Absolutely.
absolutely overcrowded. The number 7 line, the J line has a little capacity. I know, Doug, you told me that.
My favorite
that's
line.
your
I'm
favorite
a Queens,
off-camera.
I'm a Queens guy. Come
right.
on. I mean, I've used all of those lines. Before we get to the capital plan and congestion pricing, let's talk about the last week. It's been a crazy week. What impact does the change in administration have on you, your agency, short-term, long-term, different priorities? Talk to the change from the Spitzer administration to the Patterson administration.
Well, it certainly has been a surreal week,
Oh.
and I know it's been surreal for David Patterson. My hope and expectation is that the MTA's agenda, which we've laid out, which then Lieutenant Governor was involved in our cabinet meetings, will move forward. And I have confidence in the governor. I have a strong relationship with him. And I am optimistic in terms of the commitment to infrastructure that Governor Spitzer had, that David will follow through on that. He has some very tough issues that we're involved with immediately confronting him. We have the budget in the next 3 weeks. We have congestion pricing, which is somewhat tied into this.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that.
And we were directed by the governor, by Governor Spitzer, legislature, and the mayor to present a capital program to review in this period. We'll see whether they act upon it in the next 3 weeks or not. So in terms of what it means, with Governor Patterson, I'm optimistic that the infrastructure transportation agenda that we have out there, that's supported by all the key stakeholders, the advocates, the good government groups, clearly some of the special interest groups like the construction industry. There is a general consensus that, and the economists, that the MTA, as you said in your intro, it is the lifeblood of the region. The growth of New York is synonymous with its transit system. When our transit system has gone down, New York has gone down. New York's place as a global center of finance and other industries is really built on that system.
How much of the MTA's agenda is the governor's agenda? How much of it is the board of the MTA's agenda, which is appointed by the governor? Talk a little bit about governance and structure of the MTA and how the governor, any governor, would interact with the agency.
The governor is the primary player, and if the MTA is not in sync with the governor, that is highly problematic. You've had governors who've been more involved, some less. Governor Carey was a little bit less involved, and so Dick Ravitch, when he put together the first MTA capital program, really rescued the MTA, worked more closely with Warren Anderson and Stanley Fink. And so there are different ways. But at the end of the day, the governor is the most important political player. In terms of the board,
You've got there were a lot of Pataki appointees on that board that got to turn. There's got to be some kind of disjuncture or dissonance here in terms of agendas, no? Not necessarily, but it's certainly possible.
Well, interpersonal skills are pretty important in those kind of contexts.
And you've got them.
Well, that's not for me to say, but no, in terms of purely political terms, the governor's slots, 6 slots. Governor Spitzer really only had 1 appointment. Our non-executive chair, Dale Hemmerdinger. So in a purely technical political sense, in terms of appointments, neither Governor Spitzer nor Governor Patterson for a number of years will have appointees. And at the end of the day, the governor, you need a vote, you need 8 votes to pass a board item, and it's not one player has those votes. Governor needs to act in coalition with either the mayor's 4 votes or the votes from the outer counties.
Right.
It's an interesting structure, but one that in those 40 years, and thank you for the happy birthday, overall it has worked well.
Okay. Let's start with congestion pricing as a piece of the funding of your capital plan, and then move to the capital plan itself. There's a March 31st deadline where the state is supposed to actually pass legislation, get a home rule message from the city council to put this congestion pricing plan into place, or our congestion pricing plan into place. Am I not correct that there is no congestion pricing plan as of this point?
Well, it has to occur as you just described. The elected officials appointed a congestion mitigation commission. I was on that, sent recommendations, various alternatives, and now the legislature will have to either adopt a plan or we are at risk of losing several $100 million from the federal government.
Now, the governor, the previous governor, Governor Spitzer, was on board with this. Is Governor Patterson's stand on congestion pricing identical, similar, if not similar? What obstacles does that represent?
The governor was asked that in his first press conference. Appropriately, the governor said he was looking at it.
Right.
I mean, David,
and he would be looking at it with you.
David took office. Yesterday. He only knew about this for a week, and so it is appropriate for him to be looking at the various proposals, the budget, without committing himself until he has looked at it in detail. He had not up until this period. And that is what he is doing.
Has he spoken to you directly?
We have spoken.
And any advice? Has he asked for any of your opinions, advice, or is it just I'm getting in touch and I'll get back to you because I've got this new universe to deal with?
Well, this is now in the process of happening, and would prefer to keep my discussions with the governor
right.
Off
What
camera.
might you tell him?
I think that the arguments are pretty clear. It is obviously a very challenging political lift in terms of where a number of the city council persons are, and the same from the assembly. From a policy perspective, there's no question that the MTA needs the money. And
now, we're talking about what? How much money are we talking about annually or over the life cycle of your capital plan, for example?
Annually, it is about $500 million. We would use $100 million to immediately put in express buses, additional subway service, because there is capacity before we even start congestion pricing.
Okay, let me follow that. One of the concerns that have been raised by outside observers is the absolute need to develop a transportation infrastructure, or expand the current transportation infrastructure to meet the presumably increased demand of people who aren't in their cars. I lived in Queens. You live in Douglaston. You know that there are areas of Queens and Brooklyn that are underserved, certainly by rail and even underserved by bus. How much does that cost? How much lead time do you need to facilitate the implementation of congestion pricing?
We would have sufficient lead time. We estimate that we would have 309 new buses. We would have 12 new bus routes. We would add service to 48 new bus routes. Again, we're not talking about everyone who drives in now taking transit. We're talking about, relatively speaking, in the context of our moving 8.5 million people a day, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 70,000 a day over a 12, 14-hour time frame. So in terms of our system's ability to handle it, we can do that. But I think that when you look at the services, the bus and subway service that we would put in to handle the displaced commuters, we could easily handle it.
But that's with I would guess, several $100 million investment.
And we would be using $100 million of that $500 million annually to pay for that.
Okay.
Basically $50 million on the operating side and $50 million on the capital side to pay for 2 bus depots.
So if congestion pricing doesn't happen or it is delayed, it's going to have a substantial fiscal impact on your revenue stream and the ability to implement the capital plan.
That's correct. I mean, we want to use some of the money of that $500 million I made reference to. When you take that $100 million for the services I just described, you bond that money out, which is what you would do with these kinds of revenues.
Okay, so it's not exactly the revenue.
It would create $4.5 billion.
So you're bonding
a lot of money.
You're bonding off the revenue stream. Now, wouldn't critics argue that you've got a lot of debt now, and what you're doing is you're adding to your long-term debt?
The real criticism of debt, and I participated in that criticism when I was in the private and academic sector over the previous 10 years, was that Albany forced the MTA to take on debt without a revenue source. It's like remortgaging your house. And so there is less problem, and folks like the Citizens Budget Commission and others don't have a problem with the level of debt so long as it's backed up. You know, if you have a job and you have a decent income, you can afford a mortgage.
Okay.
It's when you don't have a job and you take the mortgage, which is kind of what happened with the MTA, particularly for the capital program of 2000. 2005, which is the program we're in,
right,
we were able to finance that with a bond act, with 1/8 of a sales tax, some asset sales like Hudson Yards and Atlantic Avenue. That was a pretty well-funded program. But unfortunately, in 2000, it was all put on our credit card. And that's why I have these huge debt payments, which is one of the reasons why we've had to increase the fare and why I had to ask then-Governor Spitzer to, in 2010, come to our rescue because of these huge debt payments, because we put our capital program on a credit card.
And I presume that same request would go to Governor Patterson since the problem exists.
Without question.
Okay. One of your revenue streams is the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's the only one of the units that really generates a profit, and that surplus goes into mass transit. Now, if you are cutting down the number of cars coming into the city, one would presume that one would cut down the amount of money available to the TBTA and therefore have less money available to the subways and the two commuter rails. There's sort of a law of diminishing returns here, if you will.
Well,
I mean, your policy succeeds, but in succeeding, it creates these other consequences.
Well, the income loss would be really de minimis. It's the people who are using the 59th Street Bridge, the Queen, the
free
Brooklyn
riders.
Bridge, the free ride. And so, while you'd have some movement, because if you tolled or you had a congestion pricing cordon, some folks might then take the Midtown, the Queens Midtown Tunnel rather than the 59th Street Bridge, but that level of displacement is pretty de minimis.
Okay. Let's talk about the capital plan. Basically, the 2008-2013, we're talking about $29.5 billion cost, and you folks identified about $20 billion in revenue sources, including that $4.5 billion from congestion pricing. Where does the other $9.5 billion come from?
That's the question that I've posed to the legislature. I certainly participate in that conversation, but at the end of the day, just like when we did the capital program in 2005 to 2009, those are fundamentally political, economic decisions that the legislature, the governor, the mayor, the ones who have to act politically, can determine. There are taxes, there are bond acts, there's general revenue, there's a menu of items that need to be looked at. We get some money in that $20 billion that is identified. There are federal funds. There's a certain degree of debt that we can handle while keeping our fares at the level of inflation. But it really will be up to the governor and the legislature to determine what's the revenue source. What is not negotiable, in my judgment, is the fundamental commitment to normal replacement and state of good repair.
Okay, let's talk about that, because in the plan you have three so-called tiers. The first tier, tier one,
That's
is
TIER for your
Yes,
audience.
thank you. Some of us it's TEAR, we understand that. 19 billion, which is what you're talking about, core programs, maintain current stock in good condition, stations, tracks, switches, rolling stock, and communication. You've essentially identified the money for that. That's the 20 billion.
That would be our highest priority, and you could do that, yes.
Okay, but tier two, which is 5.5 billion, is complete currently planned expansion projects. The first phase of the 2nd Avenue subway, the East Side access, and then the third is about 3.2 billion. Let's look at tier two. If the legislature and the other players, financial players, the city, don't come up with this other $9 or $10 billion, What happens to the 2nd Avenue subway? What happens to the East Side access? What happens to all those wonderful things we saw in the promo if you don't have the bucks?
They're in serious trouble. So what would occur, and again, I don't think we want to get too far.
I don't want to get too pessimistic.
Either too pessimistic or too hypothetical. The priority has to be normal placement, state of good repair. If the legislature, governor would not come up with the funds for East Side access and 2nd Avenue, then they would be slowed significantly.
And that would have perhaps disastrous impacts on the local, meaning New York City, as well as the regional economy.
Well, I think it will be very, very difficult for New York to compete in the global economy without those projects. I mean, we are already, suffering from overcrowding. We're competing for the Goldman Sachses, the Merrill Lynches, all the financial firms, other major firms and industries that locate in New York that can go elsewhere in a global context, London, Shanghai. If we don't keep our transportation infrastructure competitive, then it is a matter of time before New York loses its ascendancy and loses jobs.
What about the Fulton Street transit hub? When is that going to be done? And we ain't going to get that beautiful architecturally, magnificent building, are we?
Well,
or should
what I did do was go time out because we were in the 4th contract. We've been through 3 of the 4 contracts, and we had a bid that was about $400 million over than what we had estimated. So we've gone back to the drawing board. We've assessed if we broke the project out into smaller contracts, could we bring it in for less than that $400 million? And we think that is an option. There are other alternatives on the table as well, and we're working closely with the legislature, with Speaker Silver, and whose district this is in, very important to him. It's also part of the Lower Manhattan redevelopment conversation after 2001, and so we will see where it goes. It's part of this broader conversation on the capital plan.
Well, we don't have enough time. We've just, talked for nearly a half hour. We've got a minute left. Your hopes for the system, looking back, let's say a year from now, what do you want? You're sitting here, what do you want to tell me? What do you want to report?
My hope would be that the legislature pass congestion pricing. My hope would be that they pass the MTA capital program, although we have another year to go if that doesn't happen. If it doesn't pass, that there's a robust conversation and a political understanding and acceptance of the importance to fund it, and that we continue to move along our agenda, which is create a leaner, flatter, more integrated MTA, emphasizing our workforce, breaking down boundaries within our institutions. We have 3 bus companies operating as one. Just a lot of institutional reform work that we are doing, working more closely with customer service, with text messaging and cell phones. We have a huge agenda, and we've made good progress, and look forward to continuing that progress in the next year.
Come back in 3 months and give us a report card, because I need to talk to you about fare hikes, Hudson Yards, Atlantic Yards, off-peak fares. There's so much more to talk about. Promise me you'll come back.
We'll be back.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.